Yeah, here we are again, and let me try to find the beginning again. Now we have to talk about methods of interpreting the law. So you have already seen that the law is everything when you come to discussing a tax case or you want to find out how something is treated. Now, naturally, no text which a human being ever can write can be fully clear. So what happens if there are two different opinions on what the law wants to say? In that case, you will have to find out what it really means. And interpretation of the law is nothing else than exactly that, to try to find out what the law really wants to say with regard to certain peculiar situations or in general. So, accepted methods. Naturally, you can have disputes about what is meant by a certain expression. And the first and basic method which is used is you strictly read the wording. So that's also called a grammatical interpretation. The idea is the legislator deserves respect, and the respect for the legislator implies the assumption that the legislator knows what they have really said. So if there is a slight distinction between two formulations in the law, or which might be possible, then the assumption is the legislator knew exactly the nuances of his language, and therefore, if certain words were used and not the other ones, that was deliberate. For example, a very famous example in German law comes from the Income Tax Act. There at the beginning, it is said that everybody who has a residence in Germany is subjected to worldwide income taxation. Now, if the question arises if also a secondary residence is sufficient or if it must be the primary one, then people look to the exact wording. The law in Germany says if somebody has a residence in Germany, and it does not say if somebody has the residence in Germany. So residences can evidently be more than one, and one of them is evidently sufficient to trigger unlimited tax liability, because if it had been meant that the main or the only residence triggers unlimited tax liability, then one would have chosen the definite article and not the indefinite one. So such fine differences in the wording are assumed to have a real meaning. The respect for the legislator requires that you say if several experts and in the end several hundreds of members of parliament read the text, agreed on the wording, and then agreed to it and turned it into law, then a single person should not just overrule or throw all that aside and then say my personal impression of what the law should say is better and all the other ones were idiots. So you should take the legislator's words seriously. Now, nevertheless, it might be that the wording allows different interpretations and understandings still. In that case, one often looks to the systematic context of the law. What fits best into the context? For example, if the law says an entrepreneur is somebody who independently acts, then the word independent could have several meanings in the German language depending on the context. For example, somebody acts independent economically if that person is not an employee but the boss. So if that person acts on his or her own behalf. On the other hand, you could also say somebody acts independent if that person does not need help. For example, you could say, well, somebody is so bad in household things and everyday life affairs that that person is absolutely dependent on others, and so absolutely not independent, an absolute idiot. Now, the word independent allows the both understandings, but naturally here the context would tell us entrepreneur. Here the law speaks about business things, and so naturally, the context suggests that the business meaning of independent is meant, so that somebody is meant by the word independent, who has no boss but is his or her own boss. Sometimes also one can ask for what the historical intention of the legislator was. So you might try to clear up what the people who wrote the text of the law wanted to say. Sometimes there is additional material where the people who made the draft of the text explain to Parliament what they meant by that, and that can also clarify the intended meaning of the text. But here a certain caution is required because the draft text is usually made up by one or two experts, and the reasons for which the draft text has been made up is not necessarily identical with the reasons and motivations under which all the 500 or 600 or I don't know how many hundred members of Parliament accepted and voted for that wording. So you cannot necessarily and convincingly conclude that what the original drafter of the law text meant and wanted to say is also that what the people who in the end agreed and decided upon that law text understood by it and wanted to express. That is one of the reasons why the historical intention cannot always clarify everything. It's one indicator among others to clarify the meaning of the text, but the other ones are probably better. A fourth method is also the argumentation with the aims of the law. In cases of doubt, the interpretation should be in line with what one can reasonably assume that the aims of the legislator have been. For example, it would be surprising if an interpretation which you bring forward for a legal text turns out to have effects which completely ruin or which are completely opposed to very well-known overall aims of the legislator. So that you could say if the wording allows a choice between two different interpretations, we have difficulties in assuming that the legislator really wanted to bring forward a command which leads to, let's say, a complete ruin of the lives of certain people, or which is in complete conflict with basic decisions which otherwise underlie the law, and so on. Teleological approach is so chosen very often. By the way, these four methods are also in principle the same methods which apply to the text of European Union law, although there the wording of the text has a different importance. Whereas in a national text, one can reasonably assume that all the members of Parliament understood the exact nuances of the text and were able to say and to see what they voted for. That assumption cannot be upheld in a case where 600 or 750 members of Parliament vote on 24 or so different language versions of a text, and where the natural situation is that all these 24 different versions must convey the same meaning, but every member of parliament normally only understands one language version of the text. So you can, for each individual version and wording of an EU text, not suppose that the vast majority of the members of parliament and the other people agreeing on that text in the council, for example, were fully aware of all the slight nuances of the wording. So here the respect for the legislator requires that you stand down from that assumption and rather say the respect for the legislator requires the idea that the wording is in one language is only a rough indicator of what the people wanted to say, that you have to make a comparison of all the 24 language versions, and even that what comes out can only be regarded as yeah, an indicator for what the people deciding on the text meant. The system of the text, and especially the teleological approach, is there far more important. For example, if you can say that the mass of different language versions allows two different understandings, then very often you can argue that one of these interpretations leads to outcomes which are in brutal conflict with basic aims of the EU, so of the legislator. So keep in mind that when it comes to the interpretation of EU texts, these methods have a different importance. There, especially the fourth method has an extremely high importance, because very often the interpretation of the mere wording can only be a kind of starting point, and when you then end up with many different possible interpretations, you can very often rule out several of them just by bringing forward that if you chose that interpretation, the outcome would be damaging to aims of the legislator of high importance. Yeah. Now, very often the interpretation of a law can be unclear, or people can have an interest to make it unclear, because taxation is about your money. And so if you can bring forward a different way to interpret the text of the law, you will probably try. Perhaps you could win. And so whenever the interpretation of the law is not clear, you need a neutral person to decide. You can't leave the decision to the fiscal authorities, because the fiscal authorities are trained in interpreting and following laws, but on the other hand, they are interested in your money. So they will have at least a subconscious bias against you if you bring forward an interpretation which is in your favor. So it is mandatory, it's necessary that you have independent persons deciding if a dispute is brought forward, that independent persons then decide on the interpretation and decide on which arguments on the interpretation of the law are more convincing. These neutral persons are naturally judges who sit in courts. In Germany, the first instance or institution which is dealing with your case if a matter goes to court is the Finanzgericht, that is the fiscal court. The general abbreviation is FG, so FG Düsseldorf would be the Finanzgericht of Düsseldorf, which is competent to decide on everything which goes to court in the region around the German city of Düsseldorf. The fiscal court investigates into all things which are relevant for the decision of the case. So they have to find out the facts, everything which has happened, and then have to apply the rules of the laws to these facts which they found in order to find out which outcome the law demands. You know, there was always an if-then construction. So if there is a certain situation, then certain consequences have to be drawn. And the fiscal court first has to find out what was the if. So what was really the situation, and then which then consequence is ordered by the law. Now, it might be that somebody has doubts that the Finanzgericht decided correctly, so you can let, at least in most cases, your decision, which you got from the Finanzgericht, you can have it reviewed by a higher instance, by the Federal Fiscal Court, the so-called Bundesfinanzhof. And the Federal Fiscal Court has a peculiarity. As a higher court, it does not check the facts which the local court found. It just takes the facts for granted. That makes sense because the Federal Fiscal Court is far away from the matter, whereas the local court is in the region and could really investigate. And so for traditional reasons, because in former times, naturally, a court sitting in Munich could never check what had really happened in Cologne or so. For that reason, these higher courts, like the BFH, restrict themselves to just checking the correct interpretation and application of the legal rules to the facts which the fiscal court found. So if, for example, you forget to mention certain facts or to present certain proofs to the fiscal court, you never get a second chance to bring in that facts with relevance for the decision of the courts. So that's something which tax advisors not always know in the beginning, but which can become very decisive. You must present to the local court already all the facts which might become relevant for the decision of the case. You cannot wait for the decision or the procedures in a higher court to bring forward new facts. Okay. Now, sometimes you remember that I told you that German VAT law, as other VAT laws of member states of the European Union, is strongly regulated by harmonization by EU directives. Now, sometimes one has to find out what the orders of EU law are, and so sometimes you have to read the directives and to ask, if the directive is not clear, to ask for a binding and clear interpretation of EU law with regard to the case. In that case, the legal order in the European Union is that there is only one competent court which can, with binding effect, interpret European Union law, and that's the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. The reason is, if you want to create a single text, let's say a directive, which gives identical rules to all states of Europe, it cannot be tolerated that afterwards the understanding of that identical rules is different in the different states. And so the legal system says, whenever a question arises where a higher court or where the last court in a certain concrete proceedings has to make a decision, and that decision depends on the interpretation of an EU norm, then the European Court of Justice has to be asked for a binding interpretation of that EU law with regard to the case. So you can explain yourself in a way that you can say, sometimes when it comes to the interpretation of the German VAT Act, when the wording is not perfectly clear, then you can assume at least one thing: the German Parliament wanted to follow the orders of the EU, So if you want to find out what they wanted to say, you need to find out what the EU wanted you to say. And if the EU directive is not perfectly clear, you will then have to approach the European Court of Justice first to a clarification what the EU directive wants to say. Very often you have this procedure used in VAT legal disputes, and so very often you get highly interesting interpretations which are also binding from the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. They are regularly published, naturally. Sometimes it might also happen that a certain rule in a tax law is suspected to violate the German constitution. And in such a case, ladies and gentlemen, well, the constitution may not be violated. In such a case, the legal rule would not be valid or would have to be corrected by parliament. Now you can imagine if every local judge could just rule that a certain rule violates the constitution, then half of the judges would probably no longer apply the legal rules, but just say, this rule doesn't convince me, it violates the constitution, I don't consider it. That would create a chaos, and that is the reason why in Germany also the decision if a law violates the constitution has been monopolized and has been handed over to a specialized court, the German Constitutional Court, or called the Bundesverfassungsgericht. So in cases where a court suspects that a rule is not constitutional, that court will also hand over that question for a preliminary ruling to the Federal Constitutional Court, the Bundesverfassungsgericht, and can then only decide after the Bundesverfassungsgericht has given its answer, and then that answer will be considered by the local court in its decision of the case. However, there is a strict hierarchy in the legal order. EU law always prevails over national law and even prevails over every national constitution. That is an established principle which is acknowledged by everybody, although the German Constitutional Court takes great efforts not to admit it openly. And from time to time they try to bring forward that would not be absolutely true. But in theory and in practice, one can say that the German Constitutional Court has no right to declare any EU measure as unconstitutional, because the German Constitution cannot overrule EU law, but the other way around would be possible. And as far as a member state has to obey rules of the EU, so only the European Court of Justice could decide about the question if an EU law is legally valid or not, or if it violates a higher rule or not. For this purpose, especially, it has been created a charter of rights of the European Union, by which the European Court can check EU legislation if that violates higher principles. So the kind of constitution of the EU to which the European Union law can be compared and in some cases be declared as, let's call it, unconstitutional, that would be the Charter of the European Union. And also, in addition to that, European Union directives and regulations are not allowed to violate binding rules of the EU treaties as such. Now, there is another important source for legal certainty, because in order to treat all cases equally, the fiscal administration also organizes itself in a way that all fiscal officers, irrespective of where they work and how they are educated, are obliged to hold the same interpretation of the law during the fulfillment of their duties. So every fiscal officer has naturally the right to their private opinion, but as long as they act for the ministry, they are bound to follow the ministry's opinion when they interpret the law. The idea is otherwise, your taxation would no longer depend on the law, but on the coincidence by which fiscal officer your case has been worked on. And that shall be strictly avoided. Now, the fiscal administration usually coordinates its views and agrees on a view which they commonly hold, and that is later then published and sent round to the members of the fiscal administration. But nevertheless, or in addition to that, the fiscal administration also publishes that opinion, usually to the public. There we can get access to administrative directives of the Ministry of Finance, which usually give a very thorough comment on the details and their interpretation for a law. You can alternatively perhaps also translate that as rulings, because in the one or other English-speaking country, such a kind of administrative directive would be called a ruling, where the administration explains to the people how it understands the legal rules with regard to certain cases. Such a denomination ruling might be convenient in some concrete cases because the German word is Richtlinie and the abbreviation ESTR would, for example, be Einkommensteuerrichtlinie, and if you use ruling as an equivalent for administrative directives, you could also read EST rulings, and that would greatly help you memorize the meaning of ESTR. There are also, on minor questions, circulars of the Federal Ministry of Finance, so-called Schreiben des Bundesfinanzministeriums, where fiscal officers are instructed how a certain, usually narrow question of interpretation of a specific law has to be decided by them. Sometimes these things can end up relatively lengthy, and you could then also find a denomination like application decree, which would be in German Anwendungserlass. And in order to simplify your memorization of that word, it might also be a good idea, although not fully correct, to translate Erlass by edict, because USDAE would then be translatable as Umsatzsteuer Application Edict. And that is also a kind of administrative directive on the USDG, the German Value Added Tax Act. All these rules or all these texts have a similar effect. They are only binding for the members of the fiscal administration because their only aim is that all members of the fiscal administration shall hold the same view on the law. Now, the opinion of the fiscal ministry is not binding on the citizens, only the law itself and the correct interpretation of the law. And so you can challenge the ministry's interpretation in court, and the administrative rulings or administrative directives, circulars, and so on are absolutely not binding for the courts, because the courts are independent from the ministry. The ministry cannot give them orders. And otherwise, if they were subjected to what the ministry brings forward as opinion in such texts, they would no longer be neutral. Yeah? They are also not binding for the citizens, because citizens are only bound by the law. And naturally, again, it's correct interpretation. But if you think the interpretation of the ministry is not in line with what you think is the best understanding of the law, according to all the traditional methods how to interpret a law, you would challenge that interpretation and say that the ministry or the administration applied the law wrongly to your case, and then a court would decide. That's plain and simple. In practice, nevertheless, these administrative directives have grave consequences. The first is a very convenient one. If you, in your understanding of the law, and especially in its application, follow the official view of the fiscal authorities, there can be no disputes about the correct interpretation. So if you hold the same interpretation, then the fiscal administration in these texts, the fiscal officer is obliged to hold the same opinion, so you can avoid disputes there. On the other hand, you can still think that a different interpretation is correct, and then you can foresee that the fiscal officer is going to oppose your interpretation and to decide differently about the case than you wanted that. So you will, in all probability, have to object against his or her decision and then go the way to court. And there you have a chance to try to convince the judges in court that your interpretation is based far better than that of the fiscal authorities. So then everybody will have to bring forward what the arguments are, and the courts will decide what's indeed the most authentic understanding of the law. By the way, if it comes to declaring facts in a tax declaration, usually the questions which the fiscal administration poses you in a tax declaration are already directed at certain legal points. So they ask you how high your income from business was also. Now, if you hold a different view on if something was income from business or not, you would probably answer that question differently from what they expect. And there one says there is a kind of an obligation. If you think that when they ask you for income from business, certain things, or for other things, yeah, that term doesn't cover what you did, but you know that they have a different understanding, then the courts say you have to inform them. You can declare differently, but you have to inform them that there was the other event which you did not regard, let's say, as income from business, but which is, as you know, regarded by them as income from business. So you have to inform them about the full facts so that they can bring forward their opinion and get the full data which they can apply to the case, so that you then later can fight over the case in court. What is not allowed is just to remain silent, because that would mean, although you know they have a different view than you have, you hide certain facts from them in order to obtain a better fiscal treatment, that they just have to follow your opinion because they don't know about divergent facts. So then you could be punished for tax fraud. So sometimes it might be important to know also about the interpretation which they hold. You are not necessarily bound to follow it, but if you know that they hold a different interpretation, you must take that into account, and you can't just silently hide information which they want to have from that. So you must be open and disclose that you hold a different view. Then you can do whatever you like. Okay, so courts will decide, and the decisions of the courts are later regularly published And that is naturally done in an anonymous way, so nobody gets informed in full public what you earned last year and which strange views you held in front with regard to your income taxation or value-added taxation in order to save money or so. Strictly anonymously, the decisions are published, and only that part which is of general interest. And what is of general interest is usually your legal arguments and what the court said of them, because that's a kind of saving efforts. When people know from the published decisions of a court that that court regards certain arguments as not convincing, then you can save yourself time and money if you never bring a case to court where you only have these weak arguments. So that saves them work and that saves you money, because imagine they have already 10 times rejected a certain argument as nonsense. If you intend to bring it forward for the 11th time, they are not going to let you win. Because if there is an established legal understanding, nobody is going to change their views just arbitrarily, just because you come. You would need strong arguments to convince them. So you would need arguments which nobody else ever brought forward before you in order to convince them to change their mind. The same applies to court decision of the European Court of Justice. Also, they are published. You can get them under the homepage www.curia.eu. In all official language, so including in English. Whereas naturally the Bundesfinanzhof, as a German national institution, only publishes its decisions in German. Here one can try a translating program, but one should never really believe what it says. So one should check if that can be true, and there the best way is probably to learn a bit of German, or to ask a German or to talk. If you get such an automatic translation or so, then definitively talk with a German about the original text, and should be somebody from the field of taxation if your understanding of the text is correct, because naturally with automatic translations many progresses have been made, but that such a machine can fully understand the full nuances of a legal expression or so, that's highly doubtful and should never be trusted. Good. Again, the importance of such court decisions is simply if the taxpayer follows the generally known interpretation of the courts, then the taxpayer will win in court. And by the way, if the court rules against the interpretation held by the fiscal authorities usually know that if a second case with these arguments will be brought forward, the same court will usually not change its opinion. So usually also the fiscal authorities study the court decisions and take them into account when they form their official opinion on the law. Very often the publication of BFH decisions is made by or is accompanied by an order of the fiscal ministry that the interpretation brought forward by the court shall in the future be observed by every employee of the German fiscal administration. Also, that serves just to save unnecessary efforts, money, and time, because naturally, if the fiscal administration knows if the taxpayer can bring them to court and will win, then it makes no sense to start a legal dispute. And naturally, if the taxpayer knows if I bring the matter to court, I will win, and they will bring it to court, and so the chances for the fiscal administration to win based on an interpretation of the law which has already been discarded by the courts is very, very low. Okay, enough for this video, and see you again soon. At least I hope so. Don't forget what you perhaps have already forgotten. If you like the video, like it and share it with others, with people whom you like. If you didn't like the video, share it with people whom you don't like. And if this video has been shared with you by somebody else, then think about the obvious question. Goodbye, and come back soon whenever you are motivated to do so. I hope to see you soon again. Thanks for watching. Till next time.